Amy wrote, "Shadows are created around us whenever something or someone blocks the light. We are created to live in the light. He is calling me out of the darkness. Turn toward the light and the truth."
Amy's outlet was her journaling. She wrote to me about the Bible and having faith. I believe that her faith was important to her because she lived by her faith. She was the salt of the earth, genuine and loving. I found out that Amy had passed in a phone call from our mutual friend. In the next sentence, I found out how she had passed. It's not a phone call, you want to get.
911, the sign is recorded. What's the address of your emergency?
Hi, this is Brian Fanion. I'm at North Road. My wife just shot herself. Can you send me some help?
All right, Brian, we'll get him right out there, okay?
I remember my supervisor telling me we have a death investigation in Westfield, and it's a police officer's wife. That was a rarity to me. I had not experienced a case like that.
She's gone. I'm sorry. God.
Okay. Are you sure?
Yes, yes.
Brian's role at the Westfield Police Department, he was their evidence guy in the Detective Bureau.
We both knew Brian. He was very well respected.
When you walked in the Fanion house, what did you see?
Then I walked into the dining room, and that's when I observed the body of Amy Fanion and a pool of blood on the floor.
With a gunshot to the right side of her head.
I saw the .45 caliber Smith & Wesson firearm on the stairs that led to the breezeway. There was a police radio, paperwork, mail, and so forth, chairs pushed about.
And on top of this dining room table, you had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich intact on a plate. You had an empty plate that had some blood smear on it.
What was Brian's demeanor when you arrived?
He seemed like he was in a state of shock. He was looking straight ahead.
She snapped. The gun just exploded. It was just so quick. She didn't hesitate at all.
I'm the only one that could make her that angry.
I offered him my condolences. I told Brian that, that I was going to conduct a thorough investigation, that it was going to be by the numbers.
Is it standard for the district attorney's office to be involved in a suicide investigation?
Yes. Part of our duties at the district attorney's office was to investigate all deaths.
What can this deceased tell us about what happened right before she found herself in that state? So I'm taking in everything that I can about that scene, and I saw the entry wound to her head. It didn't seem right in that moment. How would something like that happen?
It was 1 p.m. on May 8, 2018, when Massachusetts State Police detectives arrived at a farmhouse in Westfield. 51-year-old Amy Fanion lay dead in the dining room from a single gunshot wound to the head. Detective Mike McNally.
Amy was essentially in a pile of blood that was beginning to congeal under her left side.
Amy's husband, Brian Fanion, a detective in the Westfield Police Department, had called 911 minutes earlier, reporting that his wife had shot herself. The dining room, rearranged to accommodate medical personnel, was in disarray as detectives worked to identify clues of what may have happened.
There was a blood spatter around that window frame from that dining room into the breezeway. There was a pair of glasses that looked like it had some kind of red-brown spatter on it.
And then there was the bullet. Detectives Brendan O'Toole and Mike Blanchett.
The actual projectile was in that front enclosed porch area. The spent shell casing was still in the dining room.
We could see the direction that it traveled through Amy's head. That round impacted that dresser, came to a rest right around there in the breezeway.
Brian was sitting in a chair with his back to the wall. And he's with the chief of police from the Westfield Police Department, who's talking with him. Everyone was in a state of shock.
Everyone, including Amy's brother, Eric Hansen, who told detectives that he had just finished playing disc golf behind the house when he heard Brian's cry for help. And that's when he walked into the house, saw Amy on the floor, a gun next to her, and Brian holding Amy's hand.
So he picked up the gun himself and moved it out of Brian's reach.
Because he was worried about Brian's state of mind, having just lost his wife.
Yes.
What kind of gun was used?
It was a Smith & Wesson M&P 45, Brian Fanion's duty weapon.
Did that give you any pause that it was Brian Fanion's weapon?
Yes, it gave me pause. At this point, I know that I'm gonna really do a detailed investigation.
To avoid conflict of interest, O'Toole said he decided that his unit, the Massachusetts State Police, would be the sole investigators, and he wanted to get Brian away from the house to get a statement.
I asked if he would accompany me to the Massachusetts State Police Barracks in Russell, and I took a tape-recorded statement from him.
Tuesday, May 8th, it's 2:41 p.m. I'm with Brian Fanion. Brian, do you understand that I got a recorder on right now?
Yes.
Brian told Detective O'Toole that he left his office at the Westfield Police Station around 11:45 a.m. and drove to North Road to meet his wife, who was on her way home to prepare their lunch.
What was she making?
Butter and jelly sandwiches.
Brian said that when he arrived, they continued an argument from the night prior. An argument that had gotten pretty heated that evening.
Oh, when you say heated, I guess, well,
Just, I don't know. She just was very angry.
okay. What was the argument about?
I'm retiring soon. We're discussing what each of us expects retirement to be.
Brian said he told Amy that he didn't want to spend his retirement maintaining their 200-year-old home, which Amy still loved. They also discussed their aging dog and his reluctance to get another one.
Yeah.
I don't want to be tied down by a dog.
Yeah.
She always wants to have a dog. I want to travel more than she does.
According to Brian, that afternoon during lunch, Amy told him she had scheduled them to attend a family member's play on the day Brian wanted to attend a disc golf tournament.
And I just said, no, I don't like that stuff. Why would you commit me without asking?
That's when, according to Brian, things soon took a turn for the worse.
I took my gun out of the holster and put it on our hutch because I had to use the bathroom.
Where's the hutch located?
In the dining room.
Brian said he closed the bathroom door, and when he came out, Amy had the gun in her hand.
She has the gun pointed up to the right side of her head. What did you hear her say?
I think she said, I guess you don't want me around, or you don't want to be around me.
Was she seated or was
No, she stood up.
She was standing? Okay.
According to Brian, he was 4 to 5 feet away when he tried to stop Amy from pulling the trigger.
Tried to get to her. I almost did. The gun just exploded. It was just so quick. She didn't hesitate at all. I just went over and I just held her hands. Tried to... She's held her hands.
911, the sign is recorded. What's the address?
Brian called 911 and yelled out to Amy's brother Eric for help.
Eric, how do you spell your last name? Hansen.
Hansen.
Eric told detectives that Brian said he and Amy had been having a tense argument.
And she grabbed the gun. He just was so distraught.
What do you say what they were arguing about?
No, I was just trying to console him and say, it's not your fault, it's not your fault.
Amy's death had shocked the Westfield community.
My name is Stephanie Barry, and I'm a reporter for The Republican in Springfield, Massachusetts. Amy's maiden name was Hansen. She came from a fairly large family. She and her sisters were all known as some of the prettiest girls in school, some of the smartest, and some of the nicest.
It was 1983 when 16-year-old Amy met 19-year-old Brian Fanion. Fanion came from a long line of police officers and politicians, and in Westfield, the Fanion name was a source of pride.
The Fanions were kind of like the Kennedys of Westfield. They were well regarded.
Brian and Amy tied the knot in 1985, and the couple eventually had 2 children, Travis and Victoria. Amy's close friend, Terry Liccardi, says Amy loved being a stay-at-home mom.
Amy's focus was raising her children. She thought that being a parent was the best job in the whole world.
The Fanions, deeply committed to their faith, dedicated their lives to God and community service, with Brian serving as a church deacon and working as a missionary to build wells in Mexico. After 30 years of marriage, the Fanions were planning their next phase of life when those plans derailed.
Is there any knowledge that Amy Fanion had any mental health issues or suffered from depression?
So I asked Brian, and he mentioned many years earlier when she was having some psychological issues and was on medicine for a period of time. Other than that, nothing recent.
But what Brian did stress was that Amy had bouts with anger.
She had a temper, but she hid it well from everyone but me. She only got that angry when we were alone.
Midway into the interview, Detective O'Toole asked Brian if there were any female friends in his life.
I have a woman who lives in Pittsfield that I met recently. I did a mission trip to Mexico, and we became good friends.
What's that lady's name?
Corey.
Does she have a last name or Corey?
Yeah, Knowles. Knowles. You guys aren't going to contact her, are you?
For Detective O'Toole, Brian Fanion's admitted friendship with another woman raised questions. Brian had told detectives that Corinne Knowles, known as Corey, was a fellow missionary at a nearby church. The two met in November 2017 on a mission trip in Mexico, and a friendship developed. But it had never gone beyond that.
An emotional affair?
He said there was some flirting, but he qualified it that it wasn't
sexual.
It was not his term was, it was not a friends with benefits.
At the end of the interview, Detective O'Toole asked Brian to turn over his personal phone.
I turned off the recorder. And that's when Brian told me, he was like, you're going to see some things on there, and it's not what it appears to be.
A red flag for you?
Yeah, there's several red flags. As an investigator, you have to keep an open mind.
Within a week of Brian's interview, on May 14, 2018, Amy's wake was held. Brian planted a tree in nearby Stanley Park in his wife's memory. But the investigation into her sudden death was just beginning. Detectives recovered a treasure trove of deleted text messages from Brian's phone.
There were just hundreds of texts that expanded the relationship that he was having with Corey.
On May 7th, the day before Amy died, Brian and Corey exchanged 72 text messages until 9:47 p.m. that evening. In one exchange at 9:23 p.m., Brian writes, "Good night, my love. I hope you have wonderful dreams of amazing days and nights to come." And Corey responds, "Good night, my love. I will dream of you and all that the future holds for us." The next morning at 10:30 a.m., Corey texts, "When can I hold you again?" To which Brian responds, "Not soon enough," turning into a very long morning.
And within an hour or two, Amy Fanion is dead.
Yes.
Head en route for a female party who possibly intentionally shot herself. Police en route.
Brian has not been entirely truthful to us at this point. And so we want to speak with him again.
On May 17, 2018, 3 days after Amy's wake, Brian Fanion arrived at the district attorney's state police office for another round of questioning.
Brian, so we just needed to, clarify some things. We do know your Miranda rights, but I'm going to read them off this form.
Yeah, the other day you didn't do this. Has something changed?
So you're not under arrest or anything.
Well, I know that.
And on that same day across town, detectives met with Corey Knowles to learn more about her involvement with Brian.
If somebody was to say, "Who's Corey? Who are you?"
Corey Knowles, a 48-year-old wife, grandmother, and member of her church's choir, told detectives that Brian's friendship helped her work through a troubled second marriage.
Brian's very easy to talk to. Nothing but affirmation and love, and I'm here for you.
But over time, their relationship moved from friendship to flirtation.
Did I feel passion for him? Absolutely.
By April 16, 2018, 5 months into Brian and Corey's relationship, their texting gave way to something more intimate when Corey visited Brian's house before they left for volunteer work.
Was that the first time you were intimate that you kissed on that April day, the 16th?
Yeah.
And then where was that?
I want to say the kitchen. Because I got there before Amy got home.
Corey told detectives that by late April, she and Brian were having passionate makeout sessions in her truck.
Brian left work early, met up with Corey in Westfield at Stanley Park, and they made out. There was some sexual touching.
But according to Corey, Brian could not perform.
A little bit more like, because I'm still married to Amy.
We've seen the text messages. In all honesty, Brian, it looks like it's a lot more than a friendship,
I know it escalated, and I'm completely embarrassed by it, ashamed of it. Shouldn't have happened.
But a lot of people have affairs and
Correct.
don't kill their wife.
Correct.
Detective O'Toole then asks Brian to go back over his statement of what happened, beginning at the moment when Brian said he placed his gun on the hutch and went inside the bathroom.
All right, so you come out of the bathroom, right? And she's at the table. Where just indicate, like, where between the table and the hutch? Yeah. And a chair right there?
I don't know if she was sitting or standing. I think she was standing.
I mean,
no, I think she was sitting.
Now, when we were trying to get these step-by-step details, he seemed to be wavering.
So you come out of the bathroom, okay, and then what's the first thing that happens?
I just remember her saying that you obviously don't want me around.
And then Detective O'Toole asked Brian to demonstrate what Amy did with the gun.
Just remember seeing her hand come up with the gun.
Towards her head?
Yeah.
So she puts it to the side of her head?
Yes.
Okay. And where was the gun when it went off? Was it in the same?
Right to her head.
But there is a problem. What Brian did not know was that a CSI report and Amy's autopsy results had arrived.
The gunshot entrance wound was not consistent with a self-inflicted wound.
Fair to say it took this case in a whole new direction?
Yes.
During the second interview with Brian Fanion, detectives O'Toole and Blanchett found themselves facing a challenge that tested their experience as investigators.
This is not a normal interview for myself and Mike. We've done thousands of interviews. You know, we're pretty good at it, but it's hard when it's a police officer because he knows exactly how we work. It was a difficult interview.
There's a problem. I'll be straight up.
Detectives laid out what they considered to be crucial evidence in their investigation.
There's no indication whatsoever so far that she had a gun close to the side of her head.
Don't get me wrong, because she did, because I saw her, and it happened.
You know,
How do you say there's no indication?
well, I mean, that's what it's showing us right now.
The medical examiner listed Amy's manner of death as undetermined. And combined with CSI findings, investigators did not believe that Amy died of a self-inflicted wound.
I mean, there's no doubt she was shot, but the question is, from what distance?
It was right freaking there, I'm telling you. Well, do what you need to, but I'm telling you, it was right there.
In Amy's case, distance mattered. This is because with self-inflicted gunshot wounds, debris known as gunshot residue is expelled from the firearm and leaves a distinct pattern on and inside the wound known as stippling, as demonstrated here.
Like, Brian, you understand, like, guns and stippling and all that stuff?
I do, and I can't...
There's none on her, Brian. There's none on her.
There has to be, because the gun was there, right freaking there.
There's none on her.
Then they're wrong. I'm telling you, they're flat out wrong, because it was right freaking there.
The other option is you got pissed and you're a few feet away and you shot her in the head when she's sitting eating a peanut butter sandwich.
Didn't happen.
Didn't happen?
Did not happen.
With Fanion's affair exposed and CSI reports in hand, detectives suspected Fanion had likely shot his wife, but they still needed more evidence. On May 24, 2018, detectives obtained a search warrant for Fanion's home, and when detectives arrived,
Brian asked if I was there to arrest him, and I told him I wasn't. And then he asked me if I thought he did it.
Were you surprised he asked you that?
I was noting it. I didn't know how to feel, and I didn't answer his question.
detectives took additional measurements to analyze the trajectory of the bullet. Fanion's home electronics were confiscated, and at the same time, his desktop computer and laptop at the Westfield police station were seized for data extraction.
Do you see any signs that Brian Fanion planned to kill his wife? Any evidence that points to that?
We see a totality of all the evidence here. We're not the fact finders. We're detectives, so we collect all this information, and then it's going to be presented. Someone else is going to make a determination on that.
And that someone would be Hampton County Assistant District Attorney Mary Sandstrom. New to the Homicide Division, Sandstrom had arrived in Massachusetts by way of New York.
Is it fair to say you were a fish out of water a bit?
It's always hard not being from the area in which you prosecute. It's a very small, very intimately connected town. So, yes, you're never at an advantage where you don't know everybody by name.
Adding to the difficulty, Brian Fanion is a detective.
Yes. Yeah.
And respected.
Very much in that community.
As spring gave way to summer, Corey ended her relationship with Fanion, and by early 2019, Fanion retired from the police force. The investigation into Amy's death continued.
We're still trying to get some testing done because we want to have as strong a case as possible before we go in before the grand jury.
And a complication in the form of a letter was among the case files. Amy's family members expressed their unfailing support of Brian Fanion, saying, "We are certain Amy took her own life." The letter was signed by Amy's siblings and even her own mother.
That's gotta be tough for you.
It's an awkward position for a prosecutor where your victim family isn't supporting you. It was an odd spot to be in.
An odd spot, perhaps, but not a deterrent. On November 6, 2019, 17 months after Amy died, detectives arrived at Brian Fanion's door.
Brian came to the dining room door pretty quickly, as I recall it, and he said something to the effect of, "Come in." Then Mike Blanchette began to describe to Brian, "Brian, we have an arrest warrant for you."
Police say Brian Fanion told them that his wife shot herself with his gun while he was at home on a lunch break last year.
I remember telling him, "Put your hands behind your back." I took out my handcuffs.
Through their investigation, they only solidified their suspicion that Brian pulled the trigger.
He was eating assorted nuts, was popping some in his mouth, and as he put his hands behind his back, he let him drop to the floor. We transported Brian to the Russell State Police Barracks. And he's processed, photographed, fingerprinted.
Stands accused of killing his wife in what was originally reported.
I assessed a feeling of despair on Brian's face, like, I can't believe this is happening.
Stephanie Barry, a crime reporter at the Republican newspaper, recalls the unusual scene that played out 15 miles away in Springfield, Massachusetts, inside the Hampton County Superior Court in early November 2019.
There's no one who spent any amount of time in Westfield who didn't know who Brian Fanion was. It was a pretty full house, and the kind of palpable shock remained throughout the entire proceeding.
Fanion, who appeared for his initial arraignment, entered a plea of not guilty, and sitting right behind him were members of both Brian's and Amy's family.
I can't think of another instance when I've seen the family of a victim sticking up for the accused murderer of their loved one.
And despite the absence of support from members of Amy's family, ADA Sandstrom continued to build her case.
What was Amy Fanion like?
She sounds like a fairy tale. Giving, selfless, completely dedicated to her family.
According to Sandstrom, the night before Amy died, she was making a gift for an upcoming baby shower that she planned to attend and was texting her daughter Victoria.
Did anyone ever say that Amy was ever suicidal?
She wasn't a person who was ready to die. Amy was healthy, she was happy.
What do you think Brian Fanion's motive was?
He was ready to start a new chapter of his life that did not include Amy Fanion. He's chosen his life partner in Corey. Amy's the only thing standing in the way now.
And that's always the million-dollar question. Why not divorce?
He can't divorce Amy for how he's going to be seen in this community. Divorce is public, but in his mind, murder doesn't have to be.
The trial started today for a former Westfield police officer who's accused of murdering his wife.
On February 23, 2023, in what would be Westfield's most publicized case, Brian Fanion's trial began. He faced a life sentence for the first-degree murder of his wife. 48 Hours made several interview requests to Brian Fanion, his attorney Jeffrey Brown, as well as family members of both Amy and Brian, but never received a response.
This is a big case, a lot of attention. How are you feeling?
For any trial, you're always nervous. And this was probably the most high-profile case I've ever done.
Opening statements revealed conflicting accounts of the circumstances surrounding Amy Fanion's death.
The defendant was a deacon at Wyven Union Church and an officer for the Westfield Police Department. The evidence will show that while the defendant was repulsed by continuing his marriage with Amy, he couldn't divorce her either, leaving him trapped. And once that evidence is before you, I will ask you to find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree.
Fanion's defense focused on Amy's anger issues and claimed she suffered from anxiety. Brown alleged that on the day of Amy's death, an argument over Brian's retirement plans and his refusal to attend a family member's play pushed her over the edge.
In the days before Amy shot herself, Amy was very mad at him. You had to tread lightly around Amy for fear of setting her off. And at the conclusion of the evidence in this case, I'll ask that you find Brian Fanion not guilty. Thank you.
Anna Hansen, Amy's younger sister, was the first witness for the prosecution. She was the only family member who signed the letter of support that willingly testified against Brian Fanion. Anna stated that during the investigation into Amy's death, her brother-in-law confided that he was worried about searches he had conducted on his computer.
I asked him what that search was, and he said how to make a murder look like a suicide.
He specifically said he searched, quote, how to make a murder look like a suicide.
Those were his exact words.
Anna told the jury that when she asked her brother-in-law why he made this search, Fanion told her that Amy asked him to do it after they watched a CSI show. It was a show that Anna questioned if Amy had ever watched.
Did she ever say that she liked those shows?
She never shared that with me.
The prosecution's next witness was Fanion's former lover, a divorced Corey Knowles, now Corey Hasty, who told the jury that Fanion was concerned about ending his marriage.
Did the defendant ever talk about what could happen to him if he were to divorce Amy?
Yes. If Amy was to ever leave, or he divorced her, that she would take him for everything that he's got because he wouldn't be able to sustain on retirement at that point.
The prosecution called Tom Forrest from the Cybercrimes Unit. All of Fanion's devices were examined, but it was Fanion's office computer that produced some curious results. Forrest said Fanion visited
common and dangerous poisons, which drug causes the most deaths each year, 16 common household items that could kill you.
But it's only when this affair starts up that all of these incriminating searches start to appear.
Carbon monoxide, the invisible killer, household poisons, common prescription overdoses.
And 11 days prior to Amy's death, Fanion used his office computer to view a news report on YouTube called What Gunshot Residue Tests Tell Us.
He wasn't assigned to any active investigations in April and May of 2018 that would necessitate looking up gunshot residue. Nobody in the Westfield Police Department does gunshot residue testing.
I was trying to keep a very open mind about what the evidence was going to show, but I didn't think that was great news for Brian Fanion.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Detective John Shrine, a ballistic expert and a crucial witness for the prosecution, testified that Amy's wound was not self-inflicted, citing the absence of gunshot residue near the wound, coupled with the trajectory of the bullet. Shrine concluded that Amy Fanion was shot from a downward angle and at a distance of at least 18 inches, not at close range as Fanion had claimed.
Would you form an opinion as to whether or not the defendant's firearm was discharged at a distance of 18 inches or greater?
Over 18 inches, without anything intervening, that's correct.
After 12 days of testimony and 27 witnesses, the prosecution rested. But waiting in the wings was a defense poised to introduce a significant element that could potentially unravel the DA's case.
Any prosecutor who's not worried about a defense probably isn't a good prosecutor.
What do you think is the most damning piece of evidence? Chat now with the 48 Hours team on Facebook and X.
Defense attorney Jeffrey Brown, whose client faced life in prison, launched a counterattack when he cross-examined Fanion's former lover, Corey Hasty. According to the state, Fanion's affair was the primary motive for murdering his wife. But Hasty admitted to the defense that when she ended their relationship, Fanion didn't try to stop her.
When ultimately you ended it with Brian, his response was okay. Isn't that right?
To my recollection.
He didn't say to you, oh my God, I killed Amy for you and you're leaving me? He never said that, right?
Correct.
And what about the websites Detective Forrest from the Cybercrimes Unit said Fanion visited?
Carbon monoxide, the invisible killer, common and dangerous poisons, 16 common household items that could kill you,
The defense argued that some of the websites he visited were related to an aging house, an old wood-burning stove, and the potential hazards it might pose to a young family member.
Did you know that the Fanions were beginning to have a young niece, a child, stay in their home during that time frame?
No, I did not.
But what the defense couldn't reconcile were Fanion searches about gunshot residue days before Amy's death. And there was Amy's sister, Anna, the only family member who willingly testified for the prosecution. She claimed that Brian told her he searched how to make a murder look like a suicide on his computer.
You didn't find any sites that were searched or visited relating to the terms how to make a murder look like a suicide. Isn't that true?
That is true.
The defense narrowed its focus and scrutinized Amy's personality by cross-examining Amy's own mother, Patricia Tarrant.
Did your daughter Amy have a temper?
Yes.
A temper, according to Amy's sister Holly, that would typically be directed toward her husband.
Well, did she snap at Brian in front of you?
She would. I was embarrassed for him. You don't usually talk to your husband kind of in that way. Maybe though you reprimand a child, but not a husband.
But would Amy's temper lead to an impulsive decision such as grabbing Fanion's gun? According to Amy's son, Travis, it would.
I could easily picture or envision her grabbing the gun impulsively to make a point that she picked it up intending to complete a trigger pull and shoot herself.
But what would explain the lack of gunshot residue on Amy?
Her wound is consistent with a close-range gunshot wound based
Alexander
on
Jason, a senior certified crime scene analyst, testified for the defense.
That's the foundation of the whole prosecution. And this whole idea that it had to be 18 inches because of the absence of gunshot residue is not valid.
Jason says the lack of gunshot residue was not due to distance. It was due to Amy's hair.
What could Amy Fanion's hair have told us?
Amy Fanion had very dense, thick hair. That will block the gunshot residue.
Jason's research, Effect of Hair on the Deposition of Gunshot Residue, was published by the FBI's Forensic Science Journal in 2004. Jason says there could have been gunshot residue, commonly known as GSR, embedded in Amy's hair. The crime scene analyst did not test her hair.
What they should have done is taken the hair and then analyzed those little specks to see if they're gunshot residue or not, which was a mistake.
Jason's testimony was limited at trial. To support his theory, he and his daughter Juliana met us at a gun range in California to demonstrate what may have happened to Amy Fanion.
I'm going to fire 2 times.
Using a .45 caliber gun and ammunition identical to what was found at the scene, Jason fired a single round into a mound of hair, backed by a ballistic skin simulant.
So you just shot a .45 caliber gun 3 inches away through hair.
Yes, Amy Fanion had considerable hair, maybe more dense than this, where the bullet entered. And the hair will act as a filter and prevent the gunshot residue from reaching her skin.
For comparison, Jason positioned the gun at the same distance using identical ammunition and fired into the skin simulant without hair.
And I pull this away.
Wow.
You can see there's a big difference. Now look at that. That's a very clean wound. That's a very dirty wound.
That's incredible. All from the hair.
All from the hair. The hair acted as a filter.
Pretty fascinating.
While Jason believes this scenario is what happened to Amy Fanion, he stopped short of saying whether or not Fanion killed his wife.
The hair filtered that stuff out.
But what he does believe is that basing the case on the absence of gunshot residue is wrong.
And he should not be convicted on that basis. That's my bottom line.
After 40 witnesses and 15 days of testimony, closing arguments.
She raised the gun up to her head in a fit of rage and in effect caused her own death.
This defendant murdered
Amy Fanion with deliberate premeditation.
On March 21st, 2023, the jury got the case. And after 2 days of deliberations, the verdict.
What say you? Is the defendant guilty or not guilty? Guilty. Guilty of what? Guilty of what degree?
Brian Fanion was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife, Amy Fanion, and sentenced to life without parole that same day.
Brian's side of the aisle just collapsed in sobs. These people loved Brian and sincerely thought that he was innocent.
For Assistant District Attorney Mary Sandstrom, Fanion's conviction was bittersweet and hard-won.
It's never a victory. Amy Fanion should be here. She should be with her daughter and son and her now grandchildren, and she's not. And it was all for nothing so that Brian Fanion could enjoy his life and end hers.
A mother disappears. Evidence points to homicide.
And she's nowhere to be found.
The suspect is gone too, leading U.S. Marshals on a relentless manhunt.
He was using the railways to move around, hopping trains.
The chase is on.
Justice is coming.
48 Hours, Saturday on CBS, streaming on Paramount+.
Hello and welcome to Post-mortem. I'm your host, Anne-Marie Green, and today we are discussing the case of Amy Fanion, whose husband, Brian, a Westfield, Massachusetts police detective, was charged with her murder. So joining me to give us an inside look at reporting on this case are 48 Hours producer Marie Hegwood and field producer Morgan Canty. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, good to be here.
Hello. So listeners, you know what I'm going to say. If you have not listened or watched the episode, The Detective's Wife, go do that now. You can find the full audio right below this episode in your podcast feed, and then you can join us after you've already listened for a deeper dive. For everyone else, here we go. What is so unusual, of course, about this case is that Brian is a detective himself. How did his colleagues at the Westfield Police Department react when they first learned that he was being investigated for Amy's death? Because he's not just a detective. He has been a detective for many years. He comes from a prominent family, and he's really well liked.
The colleagues were really shocked. The colleagues from the Westfield PD, they really supported Brian. They actually loved him. They respected him because he comes from a long line of police officers. His father before him was a detective. And so the Fanions had a legacy there as, you know, law-abiding people who loved the community, supported the community. And when they heard about this, they all came to his house in full force and stood beside him, just trying to comfort him and help him get through it.
Mm. Yeah, even the police chief, who is now the mayor of Westfield, Massachusetts, he ended up testifying and he called Brian his go-to guy. And from the beginning of the investigation, the ones who responded first to the scene of the crime was Westfield PD. But Massachusetts State Police took over the case to avoid a conflict of interest.
We heard in the broadcast, though, that it was actually really hard for them to interview Brian because he's a detective. I mean, he knows how this is going to go down.
The detectives we spoke to, the ones who interviewed Brian, they did a really excellent job. They were really on top of their game. They knew exactly what they were doing going into it.
Let's listen to a clip from Detective O'Toole.
This is not a normal interview for myself and Mike. We've done thousands of interviews. You know, we're pretty good at it, but it's hard when it's a police officer because he knows exactly how we work. It was a difficult interview.
The state police, they all talked about how difficult, not just because he was a detective, because they knew him. He was the evidence officer, so he would be on scene for a lot of these cases there, picking up evidence. So they knew him. He was known. And like I said, the Fanions were well respected. They had been around for years in that community. And so I think that was also difficult because, you're basically interviewing one of your own.
Oh, that's interesting. In the hour, we see Brian's interviewed. He's interviewed twice by police, and he kind of changed his story a few times.
So initially in the first interview, Brian told the detectives that he saw Amy standing with the gun in her hand. In Brian's second interview, he changed it to Amy was sitting. And so that was where the detectives noted that there was a flip-flop between whether Amy was sitting or standing when Brian, talked about what he saw that day.
Yeah. And I mean, if he's the evidence guy, he knows how police would think about the evidence that they found at his own scene, the questions that they would ask, the things that they would look for. Brian tells Detective O'Toole during his first interview that he and Corey, who's a fellow missionary that he met on a trip in Mexico in 2017, that they were just friends. That's it. We later find out, right, that this is not true. I want to listen to this never before aired clip of Brian talking to Detective O'Toole.
Did this Corey want to take it to a different level with you, Bri, or
we talked about that, and we had an understanding that that's as far as it's going to go.
Okay. So Corey talked about it with you, or
we both talked from the beginning. We said,
okay,
this is what it is, and just to make sure we were both
on the same page.
Exactly.
Just friends. Just friends.
Yeah.
No, not a sexual relation. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but friend, because you know what I'm saying. That I don't want
not friends with benefits. No.
Okay, all right.
So in case people don't know what friends with benefits is, the benefit is usually sex when people are talking about that. It seems like they had never slept together, and maybe that was what made the big difference for him.
From what we've learned from Brian's police interviews with Corey Knowles, the woman who Brian was seeing, they never slept together. They never had sex. We do know that they kissed. We do know that there was some makeout sessions in the back of her truck. And there were thousands of text messages between Brian and Corey that police would find deleted from Brian's phone.
So were they texting back and forth like throughout the day? How long it had been going on?
It's very difficult for me to believe that Amy didn't eventually discover the texting because it was so plentiful. I mean, they were texting every single 10, 15 minutes. I don't even know how they had time to work because they were texting so much,
Yeah.
And you could see the relationship evolve through the text. I mean, at first it was a friendship because Brian told Corey that he had women friends. Like that was his thing. He had several women friends and they would text. So having that friendship, the way it started, wasn't unusual for Brian, but it started to evolve. And even when you look at the text, you start seeing moments where they were starting to flirt. And then at one point he apologized. I shouldn't have said certain things to you. We just need to take it down a level because I don't want it to go anywhere. But then he just kept on texting. And she also wanted to get out of a marriage. She was in a marriage. So that was kind of the foundation of their text. Can you help me? I'm dealing with a difficult marriage. I'm thinking I should leave. What do you think? So that's how it really got going.
In the text messages that you guys saw, does he talk about his wife?
I mean, he does say some things about Amy, but more of it is, more
flirtation.
Was sexting? Were they sexting?
No.
Oh, okay.
There were just a lot of flirty texts. There were innuendos, but no photos or anything explicit. There were some text messages where Brian, he'll refer to Amy. He'll say something like, he'll put a sad face and say, Amy's being so clingy right now. So there are moments when, it's clear that he doesn't want to be where he is.
And I think also in context was that, he's trying to sneak and do things. Like he wants to go meet her and here's Amy, won't let him go. But he was really struggling with this because he was on the computer looking up things like, is it a sin or is adultery a sin? Like he was really struggling with what he was doing with Corey.
By April of 2018, he started Googling, can you have an affair without sex? He was Googling things about infidelity. He visited websites like My Perfect Affair, How I'm Getting Away with It, emotional infidelity, worse than a sexual affair. So it seems like he was really having this like soul searching moment of trying to figure out if what he was doing was okay, because this is a man who is a deacon at his church.
So I think he just was really struggling. Just remember that, you know, Brian and Amy got married basically out of high school. They were each other's first. And they come from a religious background where they don't believe in divorce and also adultery. So he was really struggling, you know, in terms of what he was doing.
And so here we have another case, right, where the big question is, was the victim's death a suicide or was it a homicide? I feel like there's been several like that this season. The prosecution alleges that Brian killed Amy, but the defense argues that she shot herself in the midst of an argument. One of the biggest questions that we've heard from our audience was about the gunshot residue, and I was wondering that myself. Do they test Brian Fanion's hands for residue?
So I know 48 Hours viewers always want to know about the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, the detectives who responded to the scene, they did actually have Brian and Amy's hands tested for gunshot residue. And both of their hands tested positive for gunshot residue. So it was sort of inconclusive. You know, it didn't tell them any information about, say, who was holding the gun. But part of the reason that might have happened, Brian says that he was holding Amy's hand after she was shot and fell to the ground. So there could have been a transfer of gunshot residue. We don't know.
There's another aspect to it that was not in the show is that he actually did wash his hands. So they fingerprinted Amy's thighs, her legs. You could see where his handprint was. And even her brother who came into the house, he had testified saying that, yes, Brian was holding her hands, had his hands on her thighs. But once he did that, he had blood on his hands. That's what was said. We didn't have pictures of that, but we do know right before the detectives arrived that he did wash his hands.
It seems like with every one of these hours, when I say, but didn't they test the hands? The answer is there's gunshot residue everywhere. And so it's really difficult to determine, who was holding the gun at the time.
Yeah. And I think the thing, the biggest thing was there fingerprints on the trigger? Because that was a question that, who pulled the trigger?
Right.
Mm-hmm. So they did test the gun for prints. That was another test that was kind of inconclusive because there weren't sufficient prints on the gun to make an identification. It's something called friction ridge detail that they found on the gun. It's not quite enough to get a fingerprint off of. And so they couldn't identify if anyone's fingerprints were on it. But they also tested the gun for DNA. And on the gun, they found positive profiles for both Amy and Brian.
Of course, it's a gun that's in their house. It would, even if, it would stand to reason that his DNA would be all over it. So,
of course.
Yeah.
And also, Amy's brother, Eric, as Marie said, came into the house. He saw Brian distraught. He saw the gun next to him. He decided to pick the gun up and move it outside so that Brian might not hurt himself with the gun. And when testing was done on the gun, they found an additional minor profile. We don't know whether or not that was Eric Hansen, Amy's brother, or not, but he did pick up the gun. Brian's DNA was found on it. Amy's DNA was found on it. Eric's also could have possibly been on it, but they couldn't positively identify his DNA.
Right.
And one thing I just want to bring up too, that, that's not in the show, but that in testimony, they talked about the trigger on his gun, the weight of the trigger, how difficult is it to pull. And for a police officer's gun, evidently, this was a lighter weight. So it was easier to pull the trigger.
Oh.
So, that kind of lends itself a little bit to, did she pick the gun up and actually pull that trigger? Not realizing how easy it would be to go back. We don't know. But that was part of the testimony about the weight of the trigger.
Wow. Okay. So police actually don't arrest Brian until 17 months after his first police interview, when they finally feel they have enough evidence against him. And one of the biggest pieces of evidence against Brian was the CSI report and autopsy results that concluded the gunshot entrance wound was not consistent with a self-inflicted wound. And there's also no gunshot residue or GSR found on Amy's head.
And there's also, the prosecution talked about stippling and tattooing. So when the gun is fired, this particular residue just sometimes makes a tattoo or a marking around the wound, and that wasn't present. The defense said that her hair might have been in the way of that.
The defense, their expert, Alexander Jason, he testified that the hair was the reason there was no gunshot residue on her head. So he says that the reason for the lack of gunshot residue wasn't distance at which the gun was fired. It might have just been because Amy's hair was in the way and it caught all of it.
But did they even test that?
So that's a really excellent question.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that came up a lot in the trial. No one on the prosecution side did any testing of the hair for gunshot residue. On the scene, there was some looking at the hair, looking at the wound. At the autopsy, the medical examiner, Dr. Robert Welton, he extracted some of Amy's hair, looked at it, and sent it away to the crime lab.
The biggest thing here was that gunshot residue is light. So she was on the ground, and by the time they picked her up, that gunshot residue could have fell out of her hair. We don't know. So the time to test and look in the hair would be when she was there at the scene. That's when her hair should have been collected and bagged. We do have photographs of some type of residue in her hair. We just don't know what it is. And just like the expert Alexander Jason said, we should have tested it on the scene. So that was the biggest error in terms of CSI work, is not testing Amy's hair, bagging it right there on the scene.
Welcome back. We're going to dig into the trial now. And at trial, the prosecution raised a lot of damaging evidence against Brian. So I want to ask you guys, what stood out the most to you?
I think the web searches.
Yeah, so just about 10 days before Amy was shot dead, Brian was making multiple searches for GSR testing, which was pretty strange because at the Westfield Police Department, that's not something that they do. So there's not necessarily any reason that he would have been doing these searches or any justification. He visited a couple of different websites related to GSR testing. He watched a couple of YouTube videos related to GSR testing and what that can tell us. So that raised questions for the prosecution about why he could have possibly been conducting those searches.
But the thing is, in terms of what we've received in terms of evidence, we only can see searches on his work computer, not at the home computer. Now, granted, it was 10 days before Amy died, approximately 10 to 11 days before she died. So he just could be a guy that just has the worst luck, that he's searching this stuff and all of a sudden now this happens. But I thought that was very damning.
The day before Amy died, he's searching several times for how to delete frequently contacted off of his phone. And, of course, because he's seeing this woman, that's extra suspicious. And then the morning that Amy dies, he was searching on his work computer about essentially the Massachusetts State Police units that would be responding to the scene of a murder.
That's a very specific search.
And investigating the forensics. So it's just odd, and there doesn't seem to be any reason connected with his professional life that he would have been searching that. So the prosecutor at trial argued that he was researching exactly who he would be dealing with after he killed his wife.
So, of course, we can't talk about this case without talking about Amy's family. When I was watching the broadcast, I was really shocked to hear that they had signed a letter of support for Brian. And they said that they were certain that Amy took her own life. They all stood by Brian at trial, with the exception, of course, of Amy's sister, Anna. What was it like listening to their testimony?
It was really interesting. And Anna, Amy's sister, initially signed that letter. But by the time the trial came around, it was 5 years after Amy's death. Anna testified for the prosecution, and she was the only family member who willingly testified for the prosecution. Nobody else wanted to talk with them. So it was really interesting to see the things the family had to say on the stand about Amy. Her own mother testified. One of her other sisters testified. And they talked about Amy's character, and it wasn't especially flattering to Amy's character.
When I looked at the letter, I was like, oh, it must be both families, just assuming because it's a long list of people. But it was really her family saying that they believed that Brian was innocent and that Amy had taken her own life. And I think that was really kind of a shock. And then even in court, there was the visual element to it because on Brian's side is where everyone sat, packed. When they testified, Amy's family talked about the Amy look. They used that terminology, it's the Amy look.
Mm-hmm.
And the Amy look was basically when you knew that she was displeased with something. They all got up there and did that. And it was kind of like in unison talking about the Amy look. There was one thing that the mother just went to great pains, didn't make the show because of time, was that she said that Brian cooked and cleaned when he came home from work. It almost felt like the mother was pained when she talked about how Brian was treated by her daughter. I think that was the part that kind of hit me a little bit because it's like, the victim's own mother, is really saying that her daughter was not the best person in terms of how she treated her husband.
So it's one thing for them to say, listen, we know Amy and she's got a temper on her. But then they find out that there's this affair. Maybe Brian and Corey never slept together, but it's clearly a very strong emotional affair. That doesn't sway their opinion of him at all?
No, and in fact, after Amy died, he went to each family member and had a talk and said, listen, I'm in love with this woman. And he had a frank talk with them. It seemed like he went to each family member, but particularly Anna. He talked to her and told her he was in love with Corey. And I think it came across like Brian was planning the next chapter of his life, definitely like the prosecutor said, with this woman, with Corey, and he wanted them to be okay with it. In fact, when Amy had her wake the wake was at the father's house, they were down in the basement.
Wait, who was down in the basement?
Brian and Corey.
No.
She testified that she and Brian, during Amy's wake at Brian's father's house, they were kissing in the basement.
Wow. So despite all the support that he's getting from Amy's family, though, the jury does convict Brian of first-degree murder, and they sentenced him to life without parole. Was it surprising to you that the jury came back with a guilty verdict after hearing all of the testimony in support of Brian from Amy's own family?
I thought it was somewhat surprising. Part of the reason for that is there's evidence there, but I don't know, for me personally, if that evidence completely proves that he's the one who pulled the trigger. So that's a question that came up for me.
Mm-hmm.
But the jury, the jury came to their own conclusion.
How did the community react to Brian's sentence?
So you hear in the show, immediately after Brian is sentenced, the courtroom erupts with sobs and gasps. And the people sitting behind Brian, it's both his family and Amy's family, and they just break down. Like they are just blown away by the fact that he was found guilty and that he was sentenced for this crime. I talked to a friend of both Amy and Brian. She didn't want to be interviewed on the show, but she told me that so much of the community still stands behind Brian. They love him. And she's a part of a church that Amy and Brian were a part of. And that church stays in contact with the prison where Brian is housed. And they believe in rehabilitation. They visit with Brian. They talk with Brian. And they also correspond with other inmates at the prison. And they're in favor of everybody's rehabilitation.
Wow.
I think the thing with Brian and Amy, the family there, is that they're very much a religious community. God is the center of their life. I think in the back of my mind, I said, I really hope that whatever Brian is saying or having them to believe, I hope it is the truth, because they definitely do love him and support him.
Mm-hmm. Well, we learn at the end of the hour that his conviction is under appeal. What do his prospects look like, though, in terms of getting this conviction overturned or getting another trial?
So that remains to be seen. The case is under appeal. His appellate attorney, Rosemary Scapicchio, she's a pretty big deal. There's a trial on Netflix. It's called Trial 4. It's about a wrongful conviction case. She spent 10 years uncovering corruption in the Boston Police Department. So I feel like if there's somebody to help Brian out with this, it's her.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, definitely her. I spoke to her a few times over the phone. She did not make an appearance on our show because they talked and they decided that she would not. But she's a heavy hitter. And I think that, with her on this case, he's got a chance to have his conviction overturned.
It'll be interesting to watch as things move forward. Marie Morgan, it's great talking to you about this case. You gave us so many tidbits that just filled out the characters. You really helped to bring color to this story. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All right, everyone, listen, you know what I'm going to say. Join us next Tuesday for another post-mortem and watch 48 Hours on Saturdays, 10, 9 Central on CBS and streaming on Paramount+. And if you are liking the show, please rate and review 48 Hours on Apple Podcasts and follow 48 Hours wherever you get your podcasts. You can also listen ad-free on the Amazon Music and Wondery app or with a 48 Hours Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts.